for a long way through it, in fact, right the way through to almost the very end, the sensei makes a point of not directly preaching Buddhism. This was important. He greatly revered and respected this wonderful old scholar, so famous for his understanding of history, and what's more, a very profound understanding. And it isn't right until the end of the book that he actually begins to talk pure Buddhism to him and to Shakabuku him. So our job, I felt, in the New Century group was to specifically relate Buddhism and the Buddhist view to each chapter, because that is not necessarily on the surface expounded by Sensei, although, of course, everything he's saying is in fact coming from his understanding of Buddhism. So, therefore, we named each section Buddhism and so-and-so. This section, number 7, the significant number, is called Arms and War, but I called this session Buddhism and War and Peace, okay? So first of all, since the subject is arms and war, we'd better consider about this matter of the karma of war, which, for good or ill, and I'm sure in the future it'll be for good, exists very strongly in Europe, obviously, because we have more than 1,000 years history of almost continuous warfare of one sort or another, right up to the end of World War II. And that's an awful long time, and involves an awful lot of causes with an awful lot of effects. And the fact is that every one of us who lives in Europe today, whatever our background on the surface of life may be, we may be ancestrally from Pakistan or India or the West Indies or from France or wherever, but the fact is that we are, since we have citizenship in this country, we are British and we are Europeans. That is the fact of it. So everybody shares this karma, whether they like the idea of it or not. That's certainly what Buddhism would teach. So obviously we think of war, and quite rightly so, as the ultimate slander, in a sense, because it's so totally against the dignity and protection of life, and because it involves killing in enormous numbers. And as the years and centuries have passed by, the numbers who could be killed in war have expanded and grown and developed, as the weapons of war, of course, have developed alongside it. So it is a cause of killing which, unfortunately and inescapably, has an effect of more killing, which in turn leads to more causes for killing and effects for killing. So Toynbee himself, with his profound view of history and life, says this, that one war always leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another and another and another. So somewhere that chain of karma, hellish karma you could call it, has to be broken. And that's what we're all doing here, I guess, in this room, isn't it? So this has been going on, century after century. The karma of war is deeply ingrained in us all. And one can't help seeing, though I wouldn't stand up in a public lecture and say this, I'd say it to you, one can't help seeing that the ultimate problem, the ultimate reason for this is incomplete or incorrect or partial religious teachings. Because, of course, if the spirit is unclear or cluttered about this matter of war, if the spiritual teachings are wrong or incomplete, then inevitably the actions of the people who follow those spiritual teachings will be wrong. So we have the incredible sight of priests belonging to the same religion, basically, encouraging both sides opposing each other to go to war and fight each other. We saw it in World War I, we saw it in World War II. I dare say the same thing is going on in some of the minor wars in South America and that sort of thing. What else can this be but an incomplete or inadequate teaching? It must be, mustn't it? Which leaves such huge gaps and loopholes that it can result in priests saying the same prayers to the same deity, encouraging each side to slaughter each other. I mean, it's just unbelievable human nonsense, isn't it? And ignorance. This is the truth of it. So in the Risho Ankokuron, Nichiren Daishonin says this: the Ninno Sutra states, if a man destroys the teachings of the Buddha, when he dies, he will fall into one of the three realms of hell, hunger, or animality. Even if he should be reborn a human, he will be destined to become a slave in the army. Retribution will follow as an echo follows a sound, or a shadow follows a form. A person writing at night may put out the lamp, but the words he has written will still remain. Incredible, beautiful sentence, like all the great passages from the Gosha. So it's very clear, isn't it? So it means that those who make the cause of waging war inevitably will find themselves chained to it, if you like, slaves to it in the future. That is all of our destiny in Europe. Now, of course, the evils of war arises, like all other bad things, in the end from the three poisons: anger, greed, and stupidity or ignorance. However, in this particular section, the authors, for the reasons I've explained, are discussing arms and war and peace from the point of view of external causes and manifest effects. Sensei leaves the deeper, profounder, inherent causes until he roundly challenges Dr. Toynbee at the end of the book with pure Shakabuku. And it's Toynbee who mentions in this paragraph, this chapter, that a man called Clausewitz, have you all heard of him? Clausewitz was I think you could say he was a military philosopher, really. He was certainly very militaristic. And he lived before World War I, and he called war armed diplomacy. In other words, when all discussion fails, diplomacy continues by conducting a war, and then the matter is settled. I mean, it's just unbelievable in the light of the way we look at things today, isn't it? That any man should have preached such a thing, and indeed should have been revered by many people. Clausewitz was famous. So as Toynbee says, it might be nearer the truth to say that war is the nemesis of the failure of diplomacy. That's much more like it, isn't it? And it was Churchill, and I've quoted it before, who said once, jaw is better than war. That's simple words, but very true. So what is the reason, then, that diplomacy fails? This is looking at the surface. What is the reason that diplomacy fails and results finally in settlement by means of war? Though we know perfectly well nowadays you can't settle anything by war. So the reason, both agree, is economics. That it's always economic considerations which bring about war. So of course in earlier times, war was waged on a sort of tribal basis, basically. People would wage war. I think it's much better. It wasn't organized really in those terms of war. It was a I think Toynbee uses the words a tribal foray. A tribe would attack a neighbouring tribe because they wanted a fresh supply of women in order to procreate, in order to procreate the tribe and make sure it continued to give birth to healthy, strong children. Or they waged war on another tribe because they wanted a bit of their land, because they were short of food, maybe there'd been a drought, whatever it might be. Very simple human reasons for this. But it was on a small scale, and a few people were probably killed, but not in the terms of the mass slaughter that we see today. However, we see the same motivation right the way through the history of war to this very day. That is to say, war is waged, for example, in order to obtain important raw materials which may be missing from the country of the people who waged that war. You could certainly say the Japanese, in waging war against Southeast Asia, were concerned, amongst other things, for raw materials. But they were also concerned in the future for a market for their products. The population for Japan wasn't sufficient to use the products of the nation. And of course the same applies to the British Empire. The colonies provided huge markets, especially for the cotton trade, which at that time had been based for the first time on machinery and was being produced in enormous quantities. The problem is that production, the more technologically or scientifically developed it becomes, has the capacity to greater and greater volume. So what are we going to do? That is what people are saying. What are we going to do with these vast amounts of manufactured goods which are essential? It's essential to sell them because we have to keep the people earning money and prevent them from being unemployed and dissatisfied. So it's again one of these catch-22 situations. Equally, of course, war can be waged to defend a source of raw materials or to defend markets which belong to you. So Britain had to defend the empire because the empire, apart from the fact that later they became, I think, concerned with the people themselves at last, but initially, in the early days, the empire was a source of markets and of raw materials. So even if you think back briefly over history, you can see the same economic causes for all war. For example, the Vikings and the Normans under William the Conqueror wanted England because it had naturally great expanses of rich pasture on which sheep and so on, cattle, could be grazed, which would develop the wool trade, which was a very important trade in those days, and so on. That was the real purpose. They didn't want necessarily to kill the English people. What they wanted was the land, which was England. And then in the Middle Ages, again, economics played such a strong part because, as you may know, Britain and France were constantly at war, really. They were either pretending to be at war or they actually were at war. And the reason for that was that the kings of France and the kings of England were always running out of money. So in order to raise money, they had to tax the people more heavily, and they had to have an excuse for doing that. So the excuse was always the threat of France, the threat of war with France. The moment they said there was a threat, we've got to be ready to go to war again, and the trumpets blew, and they went round all the cities, and the sheriffs made their announcements to say, you know, that as from tomorrow, you're going to be taxed that much more. And that was how the coffers of the king, not necessarily for selfish purposes, but the needs of the king to govern the country required money. And they had to raise it somehow. So both the French king and the English king, often even they conspired to do this. Or on other occasions, they would pretend they were going to make war, and they'd march up and down the coastline beating drums and waving banners because they wanted to extract money from the opposing king. This was done by both sides. So they would then say to the opposing king, well, okay, we won't make war on you, but we need from you in return a payment of so much. It's incredible, very fascinating actually, when you look back at that history. But the reasons for war, when it did occur, which of course it did break out in earnest from time to time, was economics again. And then you can move on there to the East India Company. The East India Company, which was a trading company, a band of merchant adventurers, gradually realized there was an incredible prize in India, various other places, but particularly India. And so they seized more and more territory. And as they seized it, of course, in order to gain raw materials or provide a market, they had to protect it and keep it. So they formed an army. The trading company had a vast army. The Indian army is in fact founded by the East India Company, a band of traders. So India represented again vast markets. Napoleon, why did he want to dominate the whole of Europe? Because he wanted France at last to have a stable economy, which it never seemed to be able to achieve. And this is why he wanted to dominate the whole of Europe. And Hitler, the same. In Hitler's case, the German economy had been destroyed in World War I. The people were in a desperate state. Their economy had collapsed. So he seized advantage of that situation in order to create this ideal of the great Aryan race, who should rule the whole of Europe again. So, of course, when such situations occur, basically the reason behind it is economics, but it also gives an opportunity for those who are evil to gain power and manipulate the people, as he did. Because the people were suffering incredible inflation and economic disaster after World War I. Everyone in Germany was suffering, just the same as everyone in Japan suffered after World War II. Then what about Afghanistan? The Russians invaded Afghanistan. They'd been threatening to do it for centuries. Another reason why order and peace had to be kept in India was because of the constant threat of the northern border. That is to say, Russia, historically, over centuries, had desired to establish a port to which they had access to the southern seas. Their ports are frozen up during the winter. They can't sail off like we can from Southampton or Tilbury or somewhere and go through the Suez Canal, or couldn't in those days. So therefore they desired this port to the Indian Ocean, and the threat was always there. And all through the times of the British Empire, of course, the tribesmen, the Pathans who live on that frontier, that borderline, had played one off against the other. It was a perennial game. However, in the end, because Russia was in a serious or approaching a serious economic situation, they decided to invade and occupy Afghanistan. It's not been proved yet that their ultimate idea was to pass through Pakistan and have their port on the Indian Ocean, which for so long they'd wanted. But I think time will tell that that was their ultimate aim. That was the old regime in Russia, of course, not so long ago, not Gorbachev and the regime that exists now, because now they've found that they couldn't grab that land. They couldn't even grab Afghanistan successfully. And so they're having to pull out, just the same as the Americans pulled out of Vietnam. So you can see that there is no doubt about it that the external causes and effects for war are always economics. The inherent causes, of course, the deep karma, is because of the workings of the three poisons. And then you see the catch is, and always has been, that war actually stabilizes an economy. If economy is unstable and inflation is rife, war can stabilize it. Because to be able to, in modern days, create a war effort, you have to actually boost production in all directions. Every bit of money and everything else is thrown into that colossal effort to produce the maximum number of guns, ammunition, uniforms, boots, life belts, whatever it may be. It boosts production and therefore brings unity and stability to the economy. Uses up, in other words, the surpluses. But again, it's the vicious circle, because the war in itself, when it's ended, especially for those who are victorious, will have created enormous surpluses, because the economic machine can't just stop like that. If it stops like that, there's more suffering in the country concerned. So they go on producing. I think we see that today, even, in these absurd butter mountains and milk mountains and wine mountains and all the rest of it that actually exist in Europe. Economies just gain so much momentum that stopping them, actually slowing things up, causes incredible hardship to the people. So in other words, in the end, the only solution is an unbalanced economy again. Some point that overproduction has to be stopped when a war is finished, which leads to overproduction, mass unemployment, a complete imbalance in the economy, and a situation which is actually ripe for another war. It's unbelievable, isn't it? So I think that has a lot to do with the reason why within 21 years there were 2 world wars. It's because too many nations were in a jam economically. People were suffering and so on. So definitely that played a big part in it. And I think that both authors bring that influence of economics out very clearly in what they say. So of course we also see it now in the situation of the 2 superpowers, don't we? We know that they're in a jam, both of them, Russia and America, in a serious economic jam. And it's because, of course, they've been driving their economy forward based on vast defense budgets, so-called defense budgets. There is an imbalance in everything because of it. And the situation is grim in both countries. However, fortunately, war has now gone nuclear, or there is the possibility of it, and it threatens the very existence of humanity. So times are different to what they were 50 years ago. 50 years ago, Hitler could grasp the support of all the German people to wage war as the solution, actually, to their economic problems. But today, to wage war could mean destroying yourself, couldn't it, as well as those you're opposing. So the situation is different. So in a sense, though nuclear power, nuclear arms are the greatest possible evil, it could be that through the power and influence of goodness rather than evil, that poison could be turned into elixir. And I'm sure that is what Buddhism believes. That is why Nichiren Daishonin predicted that Causton Rufu would occur no matter what. Sure as an arrow aimed at the earth, etc., etc. So to change this karma of war, we have to come back to that point now and dig a bit deeper. It means achieving Risho Ankoku. You all know the great Gosho, Risho Ankoku Ron, in volume 2 of the major writings. Risho is establishing the ultimate truth. And Ankoku is, through that establishment of the ultimate truth, achieving a secure and peaceful land. So interestingly enough, one of the great differences, although later Toynbee changed his mind, between Toynbee and Sensei, was on that point. Because Toynbee said, first we must establish a world government. Somehow we have to do that. And then we need a great religion. And Sensei said, no, I can't agree with you. On the contrary. First we must have a great religion which has the power to change the world. Then we can establish a world government. The other way round. And of course the very title, Risho Ankoku, refers to that. Risho being establishing the ultimate truth. Ankoku, by means of which you secure the peace of the land. So we have to have a most powerful religion which is totally based on the dignity of life, preserving life at all costs and nurturing it. And the authors point out that this in its turn, or even without this, other ways have to be found to stimulate economies and keep them balanced. So they suggest better social security in those countries that have a poor social security system, education, housing, and above all, what they describe as massive aid to the deprived countries, to the third world. That is where economies can be balanced, in that way. Of course, it would mean giving up things a bit here and there. But we can't continue with this imbalance between half the world and the other half, between north and south. That in itself is a threat to establishing peace in the future. So whichever way you look, other means of helping the economies to grow without resort to war are extremely important. So we're all still slaves to the economy. We mentioned this before in other New Century Group talks. We are slaves to it. We have to change it. Perhaps there is a little glimmer of light recently in that Mrs. Thatcher is now beginning to talk a bit about spiritual matters. Always up to now, she's been wedded to the economy too. Perhaps she's seeing a little bit of a glimmer of light somewhere. The very fact that she's talked about spiritual matters is something. Never mind whether we quite agree with what exactly she says. The point is she as a Prime Minister has talked something about spiritual matters. And Prime Ministers haven't talked about spiritual matters, I doubt, for a long time, not probably since mid-Victorian times. So this is interesting. So somewhere she feels, the uneasiness of this endless vicious circle. Something has got to break through it. She doesn't know about the middle way yet. Who's going to teach her? So the authors go on from there to talk about the peaceful utilization of nuclear power. They've already agreed and are adamant that nuclear weapons must be abolished. We come back to that a little bit later. And they deal now with the peaceful utilization of atomic power or nuclear power. And of course, there one comes up against this fact that power up to now is obtained firstly through coal, secondly through oil, and both are not there in inexhaustible supplies. We know that coal one day will run out, and we know certainly that even quicker probably oil will run out. And the problem is that nuclear power involves very little in terms of such raw materials. Only a very little provides, huge quantities of nuclear energy. So it's a very economical thing to use. It's attractive economically, but of course it has incredible dangers, which you all know about. The disposal of nuclear waste. Secondly, the dangers of handling it. And thirdly, it can easily move from peaceful use to aggressive, belligerent use. Once people know how to handle atomic power for peaceful circumstances, they also know all about using it for belligerent purposes. In that respect, just recently it's become clear, I think, or there are very strong reports, that Israel now has its own arsenal or growing arsenal of nuclear weapons. This is a very worrying thing. When small countries can begin to wield nuclear weapons, even the Russians and the Americans become afraid. So Sensei says that if atomic power is going to be used for peaceful purposes, it must have some sort of system of world inspection. In other words, United Nations inspection of its use for peaceful purposes, so that it cannot be moved over into military use. I think that everyone understands that and agrees it, but the question is how on earth to actually achieve that point. Well, it may be possible. They're talking now about inspection as a result of the first agreement between Gorbachev and Reagan, and certainly the method of inspecting is possible. So one day, nearer than we think, we may see it. So at that point, I'll ask Robert just to read one paragraph. It's on, those of you who've got your books, it's on page 189. The bottom paragraph on 189.
Toynbee. Unless and until the people of the world agree to renounce the use of atomic power for war, and unless and until we have established a world authority with effective power to ensure that this renunciation is scrupulously honoured in practice, it will not be safe for us to go ahead with the use of atomic power for peaceful purposes. An effective world authority for controlling the use of atomic energy presupposes the establishment of an effective world government. By this I mean a government that will be able to enforce its will throughout the world as effectively as Qin Shi Huangdi was able to enforce his will throughout China after the year 221 BC, and as effectively as Hideyoshi and Ieyasu were able to enforce their wills throughout Japan.
So Toynbee is really adamant, isn't he, that there must be this system of inspection if atomic power is to be used. That was 1973. And now, of course, atomic power is being used. It's been developed considerably in a number of countries. So sadly, it's already in use, and still there is no means of protecting it and of inspecting it. So we saw, for example, the horrors of what can happen if one of these plants leaks in Chernobyl. Quite interesting, actually. That happened after the first session of the New Century Group. When I gave this lecture to the first session, I was talking about the leakage from the chemical plant in Bhopal in India, you remember, and saying, what would have happened if that had been a nuclear plant? And then since then we've had Chernobyl. And we'll have more Chernobyls. Of course we will in the future. People don't know, actually, really, in the end, how long those containers of nuclear waste that they're dumping in the sea will remain containers. How long they will be able to exist without leaking. This is appalling thought. So there are all manner of problems with nuclear power which have not been solved, yet nuclear power is being generated to an increasing degree all over the world. There is incredible danger in our very midst. There's a little train that trots down the Northern Line just past this building. I keep on forgetting which side. This side. This side? That side. That side. Anyway, it doesn't matter really where it is from the point of view of the points of the compass, but the thing is that little train carries nuclear waste. So while the citizens of Richmond are sleeping gently and all the other stations that it passes through on its journey, this lethal stuff is juddering along on those ancient trucks on the Northern Line. It's an ancient railway line too. You've only got to ride on it to know that. It's like a switchback. But this is worrying, isn't it? So, the possibility of disaster there, right in our very midst, in the midst of massively populated London. So when you think of that, of course, those towns or cities who have declared themselves as nuclear-free zones by the will, one hopes and presumes, of the people of those particular towns or cities, they're really doing something incredible. Sensei said that once, I think 2 years ago, in his annual speech about the way to peace. They've done an incredible thing. Okay, they may have no nuclear threat anywhere near them at that time, but they just decided we're not having nuclear waste or anything to do with nuclear weapons, peaceful or belligerent, so far as this city or this town, or even I think in some cases this village is concerned. I think it's fantastic. Because also they're sowing a seed of an idea in other people, aren't they? No one's taken it up in Richmond, so far as I'm aware. But, that's a great thing to do. Sensei emphasized this very strongly. And of course Japan is the only nuclear-free zone on a national scale in the world. I wish many more countries would follow their example. And may it always exist, and may no future parliament in Japan change it. Because that in itself sets an example to the world. If you go up to Cumbria, who knows Cumbria? If you go to Cumbria, go and have a look at the coastline, Whitehaven. Perhaps they've cleaned it up a bit now, but when I used to go and visit the members in Whitehaven, it was really a disgusting, appalling thing. Their coastline was ruined. I don't know what it was that was causing the water to be frothy and smelly and slimy all along a particular part of the coast near Whitehaven, because it's next door to Sellafield, this great nuclear plant. Something to do with it. Also, when the wind blew in the right direction, it proved difficult to grow anything in your garden. If the wind happened in one year to blow in the same direction a particular lot, then the gardens in the path of the smoke, or whatever, you can't call it smoke, the fumes from Sellafield, prevented anything to grow. You couldn't grow green grass, let alone a cabbage. Nothing would grow there. Barren gardens. There was a line of it on the main direction of the wind that followed the course of the main direction of the wind. This is horrible, isn't it? I'm happy to say we have one member now working at Sellafield, as some of you may know. That's great, because in some way he will, I hope, shakabuku someone else in Sellafield. I don't want them to leave Sellafield. Mr. Izumi The great Mr. Izumi once said, you can't do Kosanufu without getting your boots in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. Yes, we have. We've got one person in the Navy. We need them, and they should stay there, because there's work to do, isn't there? That's the point. Doing Kosanufu doesn't mean, getting out of the mud. The bodhisattvas of the earth, have to wade about in the mud in order to do their job. It's an important point, isn't it? So, of course, this is the way of Kosanufu, isn't it? In the chosen path that we follow, that's where we do it. Okay, we come together and have these New Century lectures and all the rest of it for inspiration. But far more effective than any mass demonstration in Hyde Park, say, which is a one-off event, here today, forgotten completely tomorrow, with people mouthing empty phrases on a microphone. Far more effective than that is the action of each single individual person in their own field of action, in their own particular sphere. Teachers, doctors, dentists, mothers, grandmothers, people living in old people's homes, people working at Sellafield, in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, painters and decorers, taxi drivers, bus drivers, trades unions, officials, everywhere. One person, maybe gradually joined by a few others who actually understand and practice this philosophy, and almost sometimes without realizing it, they are conveying to people the philosophy of Nichiren Shoshu Buddhism. They're conveying to people the very foundation of the principles on which the Kosanufu movement is based. So this is so important. Okay, if nuclear power is important, we want to have people, we want a Shakabuku people who are involved in nuclear power. We want a Shakabuku people who are involved in economics and who work their way to a point where they really have an influence on the economic policies of this country, and so on and so on and so on. We have to get into all these spheres. We have to go on doing Shakabuku, and in the end, of course, gradually we will. What about the alternatives to nuclear power? The authors bring this point up. There should be enormous effort going into the production of power and energy from something other than nuclear power, petrol or coal, something that isn't going to become exhausted. Now, of course, we do know there are people experimenting on the use of the waves, for example, the sea. Already, in some countries, the sun is being used. We don't get so much of it here, but the sun is used as a source of power. There will be other ways. Nothing is beyond the ingenuity of man, is it, if man puts his mind to it. But it's very easy for man to take the easy way out. The easy way out seems to be nuclear power, but it's beset with the most ghastly dangers. So I feel the more we Shakabuku, the more we use the democratic system of this country to voice our views. But more than that, more important than standing up and making speeches, more important than demonstrations, is the action of the one individual in his own particular little sphere of action with his friends. This passes from one to another outwards, and then overlaps from all of these various fields of society. That is the really effective way of dealing with it, and that is the way of Kosanufu. Okay, let's have a break. 20 minutes? Is that all right?